Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will start with today's chapter, the second part of our lectures on theories of war and peace. And logically, of course, this second part will deal with theories of peace, theories claiming that there are specific causes, factors favoring the possibility of peace. We saw, and I come back very quickly to what we already saw in our first part. We studied those theories that were eager to explain why wars regularly break out. We saw those theories locating the major causes of wars at Kenneth Waltz's first image, the individual actor level of analysis, that is to say, decision-making constraints, bureaucratic, organizational constraints on the one hand, and also perceptions and misperceptions of statesmen or stateswomen themselves. We saw those theories that consider that the most important causes are located at Kenneth Waltz's second image, the collective actor level of analysis, to quote Singer, that is to say, pressures exerted upon decision makers by domestic groups eager to promote their private, somehow sinister interests, and sometimes some politicians, some decision makers themselves, are eager to pursue domestic political objectives rather than foreign political objectives when deciding to go to war. We also came to the conclusion that these theories, though able to explain why some specific wars broke out in the past, cannot or can hardly be considered as explaining why, in general, wars regularly break out. Theories that claim, and that to some extent are convincing, when claiming that they can explain why wars break out. These theories are locate the major causes at the system level of analysis. Kenneth Waltz is the third image, that is to say, they ascribe wars to the anarchical structure of international politics. This anarchical structure explains why states have to look for their security, why they are eager to acquire power, that is to say, military resources, and these two objectives sometimes, at least recurrently, favor the outbreak of war. These theories, ladies and gentlemen, are realist theories. And since they ascribe basically the outbreak of wars to the anarchical structure, I quote again Kenneth Waltz's famous phrase, inspired by Rousseau in his Man, the State at War: wars occur because there is nothing to prevent them, there is no authority preventing states from resorting to war when they consider, rightly or wrongly, that it is in their interest to do so. Since wars break out because there is nothing to prevent them, there can be no peace, strictly speaking, according to realists. There can only be temporary stability, thanks to the prevalence of defensive weapons, according to the security dilemma thesis, or thanks to either the balance of power or the imbalance of power, depending on the balance of power theorists or the power cycle theorists. What is beyond any doubt regarding all the realists, whatever their specific explanations, they do not consider that peace is possible. Peace, to some extent, could only be possible in the case of a world government, putting an end to the independence of states, putting an end to the sovereignty of states, putting an end to anarchy. And this is what Waltz, this is the conclusion that Waltz arrives at when he says, page 228 of Man, the State at War, it is of course true that with world government there would be no longer any international wars. It is of course true that with world government there would no longer be international wars. There would be civil wars, but there would be no more international wars. But according to Waltz himself, of course, this is impossible. The obvious conclusion, 238, that a world government is the remedy for world war, though unassailable in logic, is unattainable in practice. this. We cannot bet on the existence of a world government, and therefore there can be no peace. There can only be stability or peace in the meaning of a mere truce, a mere ceasefire separating the wars of the past from the wars of the future. The conclusion that I do draw from this very pessimistic, of course, claim is that if we want to give peace a chance, if we want to take peace seriously, if we want to consider peace to be more than a mere truce, if we want to consider peace, take peace seriously, we have to consider that it has a value for its own sake. We have to drop the idea that it is a mere temporary period separating the wars of the past from the wars of the future, a mere temporary period within an all-encompassing, never-ending state of war. This is what we will do in our second part, where we will look at those theories, by definition non-realist to some extent. We will look at those theories that take peace seriously and that are eager to propose explanations of why peace prevails or why peace is possible. These theories are of basically liberal inspiration in the broad meaning of the term liberalism. Liberalism claims that peace is possible thanks to economic interdependence, thanks to international institutions, thanks to democracy, democratic regimes, the spread of democratic values. We will have a detailed look at these theories in our chapter 7, 8, and 9. But before doing that, in today's chapter, chapter 6, we will have a look at one theory, or those theories, a set of theories who consider that peace may be a kind of windfall profit, that is to say, the unexpected consequence of the evolution of warfare technology. Peace, to some extent, would be the perverse but positive consequence of the negative evolution of warfare, the destructiveness of contemporary warfare, be it due to nuclear technology or, in general, to the evolution of technology. So chapter 6, ladies and gentlemen, nowadays, technology and peace, title and the subtitle, nuclear taboo, and the obsolescence of major war. Ladies and gentlemen, ever since war has been existing, it regularly provoked its rejection by people experiencing war during their lifetime. Look at what's happened in Western Europe, la guerre des guerres in France, the last of all wars. This is how World War I was called by the French people. Great Britain also was exhausted by World War I. Maybe this explains its appeasement policy towards Hitler in the 1930s. Maybe the rejection of war explains the Munich Agreement signed by the French and by the British. We have a similar rejection of war in the US towards the end of the Vietnam War, and all the more so during the years after the Vietnam War. A significant part of the American population rejected war. So very regularly, to some extent, after major wars, populations reject war. But this disgust pretty often is merely temporary. That is to say, and if we look at our empirical examples, these wars, the rejection of these wars did not prevent new wars from breaking out. Only 10 or 20 or 21 years after the end of World War I, World War II broke out. And France and Great Britain declared war to Hitler after his invasion of Poland. Only 15 years after, or 16 years after the end of the Vietnam War, the US launched Operation Desert Storm to compel Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. And ever since this war in the 90s and during the last 2 decades, the 21st century, the US has been waging many wars, limited wars, but wars nevertheless. So in order to explain this kind of cyclical rejection of war followed by a new approval, even a new praise of wars, some historians, British historians, Arnold Toynbee notably, and Louis Richardson, coined the expression war weariness, the war weariness hypothesis. That is to say that after a war, during a given specific, more or less long span of time, lapse of time, war is rejected by the generation who had experienced such an armed conflict. But gradually, the memory of war and of its destructiveness fades away. And peace itself, to some extent, becomes boring. And thus, war becomes once again a possible alternative for the new generation, of course, which did not experience the horrors of the past war or wars. This war weariness hypothesis, ladies and gentlemen, to my knowledge, has never been corroborated empirically. But whatever the validity of this theory, for some decades now, towards the end of the Cold War, some scholars have gone further than that. They have expressed the idea that we nowadays may globally reject war as an instrument of foreign policy. The destructiveness of contemporary wars, and first, but not necessarily only, merely the invention of nuclear weapons, causes a definitive rejection of war, a quasi-definitive, therefore, obsolescence of war as an instrument of foreign policy. The first of these theorists, focusing on the nuclear technology, is the American historian John Lewis Gaddis, who coined the expression long peace. He looked at the Cold War and he considered this Cold War to be a long peace in an article published in 1985, followed by a book in 1986, followed by a book. This book that I show you, we now know, includes this approach, but is broader in its analysis. It does not merely focus on this specific dimension of the Cold War, which he considers to be a long peace rather than a state of war, as is the case for the majority of analysts, be they historian or international relations scholars. We saw that realists, now first part, do, of course, explain or claim that they are able to explain the stability of the Cold War, the fact that no hot war broke out between the Soviets and the Americans. We saw that adherents of the power cycle theory ascribed the stability, they ascribed it basically to the unipolar structure. Given America's economic preeminence, it would have been foolish for the Soviets to dare to challenge the US. Adherents of the balance of power theory, according to this theory, it was the bipolar structure of the Cold War, the bipolar balance of terror, which explains the stability. And for adherents of the security dilemma approach, the offense-defense balance, it was the basically defensive nature of the nuclear arms race, which consolidated the stability, because the more the Soviets and the Americans acquired defensive weapons, defense-dominant nuclear weapons, the more they consolidated the stability, since it became more and more irrational to go to wage an offensive attack. Gaddis's long peace explanation, ladies and gentlemen, is close to the two latter arguments of the balance of power theorists and of the security dilemma theorists. It is close to them, complementary, and yet different and somehow original. So the starting point of Gaddis. So this chapter is somehow a transition between basically realist approaches and the liberal ones that we will have a look at in the second part of today's chapter, and all the more so in the next chapters. Starting point of Gaddis is the fact that he wrote his article in 1985 and 1986, that during 40 years, because the Cold War started 40 years earlier in 1945, that during 40 years, no major war broke out between the two superpowers, despite their rivalry, and despite a lot of elements which in the past had favored the outbreak of war, that is to say, arms races, the ideological rivalry, the power political competition between the two major powers. And therefore, according to Gaddis, the Cold War was a long peace rather than a state of war. He published his article in 1985, 1986, and at that time, this long peace had lasted 40 years. And those who criticized this approach, considered to be too optimistic, of course, emphasized the fact that in the past, that is to say in the 19th century, there had already been two similar periods of long peace from 1815 to 1854, 39 years after Napoleon's defeat, until Great Britain's and France's intervention in the Crimean War, opposing the Russians to the Ottomans. And again, from 1870, France's defeat against Prussia, to 1914, 44 long years before 1914, the outbreak of World War I. And indeed, in 1985, 1986, when Gaddis published his article, 40 years was not that unprecedented. But now, 34 years later, in 2020, 34 plus 40, 41, more than 70 years, we can indeed claim that there is a long peace existing among major powers, which is unprecedented in the Westphalian international system. Anyway, Gaddis is, of course, eager to explain this long peace. And in order to do so, he distinguished two sets of factors, two sets of explanations: structural factors first, and behavioral elements. The structural elements, the structural factors are of typical realist inspiration. They emphasize the bipolar structure of the Cold War rivalry and the mutual independence of the two superpowers. Behavioral elements are a bit less realist inspired. The behavioral elements regard the rules of the superpower game that the two major powers adopted and respected, and it also includes the impact of the nuclear revolution upon the decision-making processes of the Soviets and of the Americans. So let's have a look at these four complementary causes, two structural factors and two behavioral elements. The structural elements first, and the first structural element is the bipolar structure of the Cold War. Gaddis here agrees absolutely with Kenneth Waltz. The bipolar structure is favorable to peace, to stability, or to the long peace, according to Gaddis. First of all, because this bipolar structure correctly reflected the distribution of military resources among the two major powers. There were only two major powers, and such a structure, such a bipolar structure is simple to manage. That is to say, the two major powers only had to look at what the other did, and they had not, as in a multipolar system, 3, 4, 5, 6 other powers to control. So it's an easy, it's a simple structure that does not require a sophisticated leadership to maintain it. Diplomatic caution is to some extent, prudence is to some extent automatic, regardless of the leadership involved. And when there are only two major powers significantly superior to their allies, the behavior of these allies is not significant. The behavior of these allies is not significant, as is the case in a multipolar system where shifting alliances are likely to upset existing balances. And the example that he gives, of course, is de Gaulle's policy in the 60s when France left the unified military command of NATO. This had absolutely no consequence upon the power resources of the West, of the Western alliance, because of these power resources basically were concentrated in the United States of America. And when China no longer was an ally, no longer was obeying Moscow from the midst of the 1960s onwards, this did not significantly weaken the communist bloc. So bipolar structure, first of all, contributed to this long peace according to Gaddis. And the second set of structural factors is the mutual independence. This is a typical realist claim, ladies and gentlemen. According to realists, the more units are independent from each other, the less they have contacts. In other words, any kind of contacts. Of course, the lower are the risks of war, because wars can only break out when there are regular interactions. So what did this mutual independence concretely consist in? First of all, geographically, the two major powers occupied two opposite parts of the planet Earth. There is no physical contiguity. There is no, we saw this in another chapter, there is no geographical proximity between the Soviet Union. There was no geographical contiguity between the Soviet Union and the US, and this is a peace-prone or the stability-prone factor, since the majority of wars break out among neighbors. And what's more, the two major powers established artificial barriers in those geographical zones where they met: the Berlin Wall in Germany and the demilitarized zone separating North from South Korea. So geographical absence of contiguity, geographical territorial distance. What's more, the second type of independence, economically speaking, the two major powers were self-sufficient because of their different economic system. The liberal private economy of the Americans, the collective command economy of the Soviets. So there were no trade relations. And according to realists, when there are no trade relations, economic rivalry cannot aggravate political tensions. We'll come back to this argument in our next chapter, because realists are absolutely opposed to liberals who claim that the more interdependence there is, the more peace there can be. And of course, according the opposite is true for realists. The more interdependence there is, the more vulnerability there is likely to exist, and therefore the higher the risks of war. And the last independence is the psychological independence. There were no contacts between the two peoples, between the American citizens and the Soviet citizens. The Soviet citizens were not allowed to travel, ladies and gentlemen. There were no contacts at the time. And therefore, this is a typical realist argument too, only skillful diplomats, statesmen, professional diplomats managed the Soviet-American relationship. There was no risk of nationalist pressure, of public opinions exerting pressures upon the governments, and therefore potentially warmongering public opinions, pushing the governments to act aggressively on the international scene. So structural factors, and to these structural factors, Gaddis adds behavioral elements, and here is a little bit more original. Behavioral elements, first of all, the first set of behavioral elements is composed by what he calls the rules of the superpower game. This is somehow close to the English School of International Relations. The English School of International Relations, Henry Bull and Adam Watson, claimed that the Cold War, rather than the bipolar system, was a bipolar society. A bipolar society, that is to say, there were some common rules that the Soviets implicitly or explicitly established with the Americans. Because, and this is the underlying argument, of course, the underlying assumption, because both had a common interest in maintaining the existing order. Concretely, what did this superpower roots, the roots of the superpower game consist in? First of all, despite the ideological opposition, socialism on the one hand, democracy on the other, communism on the one hand, freedom on the other, etc. Despite this ideological opposition, the Soviet Union preferred or ended up at the latest in 1956, ended up accepting the principle of peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence, no world revolution, in other words. Anti-Americans, always from 47, 48 onwards, George Kennan's long telegram, the Americans practiced a containment strategy and not a rollback strategy. They never tried to push the Soviets back from where they had managed to arrive thanks to the Red Army. So, a negatively existing peaceful existence, peaceful coexistence, but more positively, and despite their very aggressive rhetoric, the two superpowers behaved moderately. That is to say, they respected each other's sphere of influence. So they gradually transformed, according to Gaddis. We now know what they did throughout these 40 years, thanks to, of course, the historical archives that were opened after, at least part of them, after the end of the Cold War. We now know that the two major powers gradually transformed their rivalry into a kind of co-leadership, into a kind of implicit co-direction of the then international system, and therefore they were also accused by the Chinese and by the French to exert what they called the condominium, the Soviet American condominium. They respected each other's sphere of influence. The Americans did not try to help the Hungarians or the Czechoslovakians when they tried to get rid of the communist regime in 56 and in 68. The Soviets did not try to save Che Guevara when he was killed by the CIA in the 1970s. They did not help Pinochet in Chile when he was a victim of a coup d'etat staged by Pinochet with the help of the CIA. So they respected each other's influence, and they did not try to profit from the domestic weaknesses of their adversary. When Stalin died, a kind of transition period prevailed in Soviet Union during 3 years before Khrushchev came to power. The Americans did not try to profit from that, and the Soviets did not try to profit from the Vietnam defeat of the Americans, the Watergate scandal. And last but not least, the last rule of the superpower game is the fact that both agreed upon the same nuclear doctrine, the non-first use doctrine of nuclear weapons. And this then is the link with the last set of explanations, the second set of behavioral elements regarding the impact of the nuclear invention, the nuclear weapons invented after World War II. And this idea is specific to Gaddis. And therefore, his long piece actually is, first and foremost, a long nuclear piece. So his original, but of course, Gaddis, we come back to the details. Gaddis, of course, is not the first historian, academic, emphasizing the importance of the nuclear revolution. But somehow, strangely enough, the first who emphasized the impact of the nuclear revolution were not academics, but politicians. For instance, in 1945 or 1946, immediately after America bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Winston Churchill, who was no longer prime minister, Churchill claimed, I quote, that safety, it is the Churchill paradox. Churchill claimed that, I quote, safety may be the sturdy child, the robust child, the strong child of terror. In other words, nuclear impact may have a positive, the nuclear revolution may have a positive, a peaceful impact. Churchill. During the 60s, de Gaulle, this is what he said. In the case of a nuclear war, I translate his French statement. In the case of a nuclear war, the two belligerents would have no more power, no more laws, no more cities, no more cultures, no more cradles, no more tombs, no more cradles, no more tombs. In the case of a nuclear war, no more life on Earth. And last but not least, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, when they met in 1985 in Reykjavik, the first summit starting the disarmament process, nuclear disarmament process, when they met in Reykjavik, they agreed, I claim, that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. A nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. So politicians throughout the Cold War acknowledged the impact of nuclear weapons upon foreign policy. Concerning international relations scholars, this is not the case. With some exceptions, strategic thinkers such as Bernard Brodie, I put this book in the bibliography, he called the nuclear weapon the absolute weapon. The absolute weapon, in order to emphasize the very distinctive nature, different from all past weapons of the nuclear arm. We also saw last week that security dilemma theorists focusing on the offense-defense balance, of course, recognize the postpone effect of the defense-dominant weapon nuclear arm. But they are somehow exceptional because if we look at, I would say, general theorists, global theorists of international relations, and above all, global realists, they are not that convinced by the impact of nuclear weapons. Or maybe should I say, they do contradict themselves, which could also indicate that they are somehow embarrassed by the nuclear invention. Let's look at Renoir. Renoir, Peace and War, his major book. When he wrote this book, he had already coined the famous expression paix impossible, guerre improbable, peace impossible, war improbable. Peace impossible because of the rivalry, the ideological rivalry, mentioned this last week. War improbable because of the nuclear weapon. War improbable because, in the case of two superpowers using their nuclear weapon, the suicide of mankind could be the consequence of such a decision. So he recognized the impact of nuclear weapons, but in his Peace and War, his major book, published in 1962, this is what he wrote, and I quoted it in the introductory chapter of our lectures. War is to be found throughout all history and all civilizations, including, if I'm correct, our history, our civilization, our nuclear civilization. Some contradiction. The same is true for Morgenthau, Politics Among Nations. Morgenthau recognized the importance of the nuclear revolution, and this is what he wrote. The invention of the nuclear weapon is probably a revolution, and even the first revolution. Even the first revolution. Why the first revolution? Because being a realist, you know that continuity characterizes international politics. International politics nowadays is power politics as it always used to be and as it always will be in the future. So he recognizes, acknowledges that there may be a nuclear revolution, the first revolution in foreign politics since the beginning of history. But he nevertheless, in this book, comes back to his continuity argument. All history, so I include the nuclear period. All history shows that nations active in international politics are continuously preparing for, actively engaged in, or recovering from organized violence in the form of war. So in any historical period of the past, of nowadays, of the future, wars will occur. In other words, international relations scholars illustrate Einstein's, the father of the nuclear weapon, the nuclear bomb, illustrate Einstein's famous statement: the nuclear revolution has changed everything except our way of thinking. Except our way of thinking. The nuclear revolution did not change Morgenthau's or Aron's way of thinking. Gaddis, I come back to him, Gaddis obviously does not deserve Einstein's blame. He absolutely recognizes, acknowledges the impact of the nuclear revolution. He emphasizes what he calls the sobering effect on policymakers of the nuclear weapon. That is to say, since the invention of nuclear weapons, politicians themselves are confronted with the possibility of their own death, of their own suicide, if they use nuclear weapons. And Gaddis implicitly refers to Bueno de Mesquita's expected utility model of war. We saw this in our chapter 2. In order for war to take place, decision makers, rational decision makers, must expect the positive utility. That is to say, they must be somehow optimistic that their situation will be better off thanks to the war then and after the war than without or before such a war. And it is this optimism which explains that regularly wars break out. Even if the statesman is not sure that he will win, because he can never be absolutely sure, he can bet on a kind of fading away of the memory of a defeat in the case he's losing. With the passing of time, the horrors of war will be forgotten. So a risk-tolerant leader can go to war, or could go to war in the past, because this precisely is no longer true nowadays. Since the invention of nuclear weapons, pessimism prevails. Even a risk-tolerant leader can no longer afford to consider to go to war if he or his adversary possess nuclear weapons, because there will always be a risk of an escalation towards a nuclear exchange, synonymous potentially with the nuclear winter, that is to say, the suicide of mankind, or at least of millions and maybe billions of people. So this sobering effect, ladies and gentlemen, has also been studied by Robert Jervis. I refer to Jervis in a book studying the nuclear impacts. He distinguished 3 specific political effects of nuclear weapons when compared to other weapons of the past. First of all, the destructions of nuclear weapons are so massive that they are unprecedented. This is what Jervis calls the overkill effect of nuclear weapons. The overkill effect of nuclear weapons. And a contemporary author, Karl Lieber, I don't know how to pronounce this, it's a German name. Karl Lieber shows that in his book that nowadays, modern, contemporary, up-to-date intercontinental nuclear missiles, the nuclear warhead on intercontinental missiles nowadays concentrates a destructive capacity equal to all the bombs used by all the belligerents during the full World War II. This gives you an idea of the destructiveness of one single nuclear warhead, thermonuclear warhead, on an intercontinental missile possessed by at least the 5 major nuclear powers. So the destructions are unprecedented overkill capacity. The second specific characteristic of nuclear weapons is the mutual kill capacity. America lost the nuclear monopoly in 1949 when the Soviets acquired nuclear weapons too, and ever since then, the overkill capacity is a mutual overkill capacity, because in the case of one power attacking another nuclear power, this second nuclear power will always keep sufficient weapons to launch a retaliating second strike. And in this case, both will die. And last but not least, the destructions are instant. This is the instant kill capacity of nuclear weapons, since a missile launched by whatever, launched either from land, from a submarine, or from an aircraft, will need at most some minutes before hitting the target. So the killing will be immediate, and it is impossible to react once a bomb is launched. So come back to Gaddis, but Jervis agrees, of course. The nuclear revolution introduced a kind of crystal ball, allowing any policymaker to foresee the potential death of humanity and his or her own death. The costs of a nuclear war are too high for anybody. Nobody can win such a war, and therefore there is no more rational relationship between war as a means of foreign policy and the objective pursued by foreign policy. War is but the mere continuation of foreign policy by other means. War is but the mere continuation. This was true in Clausewitz. This was true in the past. It is no longer true. A nuclear war is no more continuation because there will be no more policy, there will be no more life, potentially, after the use of nuclear weapons. And therefore, nowadays the role of weapons, of armies, of soldiers, to quote Brodie, with his absolute weapon. In the past, the most important mission of soldiers was to win the wars they were fighting, according to Brodie. Nowadays, since 1945, the most important mission, and actually the only mission of soldiers, is to prevent the outbreak of wars, because they may potentially be nuclear wars, synonymous with the suicide of humanity. If Gaddis is right, perpetual peace is guaranteed, at least among major powers possessing nuclear weapons. But of course, not everybody agrees with that. As usual, theories are criticized and Gaddis's claims are criticized. The first criticism, ladies and gentlemen, regards the gap between the theoretic claim nuclear weapons favor stability because they incite those who possess them to behave prudently. The gap between this theoretical claim and the practice, the political practice of nuclear weapons, of nuclear states, of states possessing nuclear weapons. If Brodie, if Gaddis, if Jervis are right, and if they claim that the nuclear invention indirectly contributed and goes on contributing to peace or to stability. So if they are right, and if politicians are sincere when they say they want to preserve peace, if they are sincere, because sometimes politicians lie, sometimes, or maybe more often than politicians lie, ladies and gentlemen, this is a somehow personal statement, so forget it. If Jervis is right, if Gaddis is right, if politicians indeed want to maintain peace, what should they do? They should favor the spread of nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons contribute to peace, the more nuclear weapons, the more peace. This is perfectly logical. But there is only one, ladies and gentlemen, scholar who agrees with this claim. It is Kenneth Waltz. He's the only one. In his article published as early as 1984, included in this debate with Scott Sagan. Look at the title, very relevant, very significant. More may be better. More may be better. The more nuclear weapons, the better it will be for the stability of the world. This is logic. Obviously, this is not the case. Nuclear states do not want other states to acquire nuclear weapons. What did they do in 1967? They established the Non-Proliferation Treaty in order to prevent any other states from acquiring the weapon that they had been able to acquire, to possess. At that time, there were 5 nuclear powers. Nowadays, there are 8 or 9. 3 more powers acquired nuclear weapons, but they were not part of the treaty, so they did not violate it. Israel, India, Pakistan, and probably North Korea, which withdrew from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in the 1990s, probably possesses the nuclear weapon too, maybe even the missiles needed to launch these weapons. So 8 or 9 nuclear powers, which is pretty small, and a small number. In the 1960s, the best and the brightest American president, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy himself, had predicted that in the 80s, this was his prediction before he was killed, there would be 20 nuclear powers. Even 40 years later than 1980, nowadays in 2020, there are 8 or 9 nuclear powers. So the non-proliferation treaty is efficient. What's more, some states abandoned either their nuclear bombs. This was the case of South Africa before the black majority came to power. This was the case for Argentina and Brazil, who were asked by Uncle Sam, by the Americans, don't go further, stop your nuclear program. Anyway, whatever the exact number of nuclear states, there is no doubt that there is a kind of contradiction between the political discourse of the existing nuclear powers and their political action. While they claim that the nuclear weapon contributed to stabilizing their mutual relationship, and notably the American-Soviet one, they don't want other states to acquire nuclear weapons. And their arguments are the following ones, summed up by Scott Sagan in his debate with Kenneth Waltz. 3 major arguments. First, until now, nuclear powers were able to keep their weapons under control. And this is true, notably during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during the October War or the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when there was a risk of the Soviet and the Americans resorting to their nuclear weapons in order to try to control the crisis and to protect their specific, their ally, the Cubans for the Soviets in 1962, the Egyptians and the Israelis in 1973. So these crises prove that the 2 major nuclear powers and the 5 official nuclear powers, that is to say China, Great Britain, France, and the US and Soviet Union, are able to keep their nuclear forces under control, but this will not necessarily be the case of future nuclear states. This is the first argument. The second argument is that contemporary, nowadays, nuclear powers are guided by a deterrence doctrine, a non-first use doctrine. But this will not necessarily be the case in the future. Maybe some prospective nuclear weapons may use nuclear weapons in a first strike doctrine and strategy. And the last argument consists in saying that the more nuclear powers there will be, the higher the risks of non-state actors and, of course, of terrorist networks acquiring the nuclear weapon. And, of course, nuclear terrorist networks can be accused of or suspected of using nuclear weapons, all the more so some specific, that is to say, Islamic terrorist networks who accept to commit suicide. So the argument consists in saying that the so-called nuclear learning process, which permitted, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets and the Americans to agree upon what Gaddis called the superpower, the rule of the superpower game, this nuclear learning process is not necessarily characterizing future diets of nuclear powers. What should we think of this argument? There is, by definition, no definitive answer to this argument. When we look at one diet, a couple of nuclear powers that emerged after the non-proliferation treaty, that is to say India and Pakistan, what we can say is that the possession by the 2 states of the nuclear weapon did stabilize their relationship. So they were able to go through the learning process to understand that it would be foolish for them, dangerous, to use nuclear weapons. The proof is, empirical evidence is the following one. Before India and then Pakistan possessed a nuclear weapon, three major wars broke out: 47, 65, 71. Since India in the 70s and Pakistan in the 90s acquired a nuclear weapon, only one limited war broke out, the Kargil War in 1999. So the overall relations between India and Pakistan is more stable nowadays than it used to be before the nuclear weapon was possessed by both. So rationality seems to prevail. But this is another argument. Even if rationality prevails, this does not mean that perpetual peace will necessarily triumph. There is a second criticism, the so-called nuclear paradox, or sometimes called the stability-instability paradox. Stability-instability paradox. What is it all about? All the states agree that nuclear weapons should not be used. All the states know that all the other states share the non-first use doctrine. Logically, all the states can come to a conclusion nobody will dare to use nuclear weapons. So if nobody dares to use nuclear weapons, I can launch a non-nuclear, an infra-nuclear war, because nobody will dare to escalate up to a nuclear exchange. In other words, nuclear weapons do prevent nuclear wars, but they do not prevent non-nuclear wars. This is the stability, the nuclear stability, the non-nuclear instability paradox. Nuclear possession, nuclear weapons, the possession of nuclear weapons does not prevent non-nuclear wars to be conceivable, to be imaginable. In other words, the so-called nuclear taboo, to quote Nina Tannenwald, the nuclear taboo, we should not, and we agree that we will not use nuclear weapons. The nuclear taboo is somehow similar to the chemical weapons taboo. When the chemical weapons were used for the first time in World War I by the Germans in Belgium, they were perceived as prospectively suicidal weapons too. But this did not prevent wars from breaking out after World War I, of course. Hitler did not use chemical weapons on the battlefield. He used them in the concentration camps to kill millions of Jews, but not on the battlefield. And ever since, almost nobody, at least on a larger scale, did use nuclear weapons, did use chemical weapons. Sorry, the Americans used them in Vietnam. Saddam Hussein used them against his own Kurdish population and to stop the Iranian soldiers invading his country in the 1980s during the war post that he himself had launched. Assad in Syria is accused of having used chemical weapons against those who rebel against his regime. But on a large scale, chemical weapons were not used. So chemical weapons exist, but they do not prevent wars from occurring. So why should things be completely different for nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons exist, but nuclear states can nevertheless go to war, limited wars, non-nuclear wars, the case of India and Pakistan in 1999. The same is true to some extent for the Soviets and the Chinese in 1969, when both had the nuclear weapon and they had a limited dispute border in the Far East, which did not escalate into nuclear war. So the nuclear taboo does not necessarily prevent non-nuclear wars from breaking out. The last argument against the peace-prone or stability, the necessary, automatic, peace-prone impact of nuclear weapons is the fact that technology evolved, of course. Engineers are looking to improve military technology. So what did they do? They invented so-called tactical nuclear weapons that can be used on the battlefield without necessarily destroying huge parts of landscapes or cities or populations. Mini nukes sometimes are these tactical nuclear weapons called, and they are considered to be able to be used, to be amenable to be used in counter-proliferation strategies, including of the US. In this case, the nuclear weapon would once again become a rational instrument, a Clausewitzian rational means to obtain an end, a political end. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we should be cautious when claiming that nuclear weapons are synonymous with stability or peace. It is impossible, to say the least, to claim once and for all that there is a clear-cut impact of nuclear weapons upon the risks of war and the chances of peace. And this is all the more so for political scientists, because for political scientists, politics is more important than technology. The primacy of politics over technology is at the roots of political science. Otherwise, engineers would dictate what life consists in. So let's be prudent regarding the peace-prone consequence of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons do not put an end to the risks of war, except, ladies and gentlemen, except if, and we come to the second part of today's class, except if the invention of nuclear weapons, rather than be first and foremost a technical revolution, is but the latest stage of a long-term evolution, not a revolution, but an evolution of a long-term evolution, that is to say, the crowning of a kind of long-term process synonymous with the perception of war as an irrational, as a repulsive means. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is basically the thesis of John Mueller in his book Retreat from Doomsday, The Obsolescence of Major War, published at the eve of the end of the Cold War in 1989. Mueller has the same starting point as Gaddis. He looks at the long peace, the fact that no war broke out between the Soviets and the Americans from 1945 up to when he wrote the book, when he published it in 1988. But his explanation, of course, is absolutely different from Gaddis's one. What does Mueller do? He goes back in history. He goes back in history, and more specifically, he goes back to the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701, 1713, 1714. This war opposed the French and the Spaniards on the one hand to the British and the Dutch. It was won, the British and the Dutch wanted to prevent France from, together with Spain, upsetting the then continental balance. The Dutch and the British won, and after this war, the Dutch no longer practiced power politics. And this is a starting point of what Mueller calls the hollandization process. The Netherlands are also called Holland. The hollandization process or phenomenon is the fact that Holland, despite at that time being a major power, decided to no longer practice power politics. It became a commercial power. And according to Mueller, Holland's decision, and a similar decision was taken by Sweden, it was taken by Portugal, by Denmark, by Switzerland, who actually never was tempted by power political practices, according to Mueller. This choice, the decision to abandon, to drop power politics, proves, according to Mueller, that Morgenthau is wrong when he claims that all history shows that nations either prepare for war or recover from war or are actively engaged in wars. In other words, for Mueller, the hollandization process proves that war is not a requirement of human nature, that it is not the automatic consequence of anarchy on the international scene, that, I quote, it is not a cosmic inevitability. War is an institution. It is a social institution, and as such, people can decide that they can live without. And he does compare war to slavery and to dueling. In the past, slavery was normal, dueling was normal, but they gradually became unfashionable. They were abandoned, and war is exactly going through the same process. It is not yet obsolete, but it is becoming obsolescent, at least in the developed world. Just as dueling and slavery were normal activities in the past and even admirable institutions, war in the past was an admirable institution. But slavery and dueling were abandoned. They became to be perceived as not necessary to our life. They began to become perceived as repulsive, immoral, uncivilized. And the same happened to torture, to the burning of heretics, to laughing at the insane, to public cigarette smoking. When I was a student, my teachers were smoking during the lectures that they gave. Nowadays, this is no more true. We could add, the book was published 30 years ago. Nowadays, we no longer accept, or a significant part of the population no longer accept, the exhibition of wild animals in zoological gardens or in circuses. We no longer, a significant part of the population no longer accept eating foods made from animals. So institutions evolve, we can decide to drop some. War is one of these institutions. More specifically, the hollandization process is characterized by two dimensions. The first dimension is that war lost after 1914, after World War I, its romantic appeal. It's lost its romantic appeal. It is no longer perceived as a desirable activity. Not necessarily because of the number of people killed in World War I. Mueller reminds us, rightly so, that the American Civil War, the War of Secession in the 1960s, killed more soldiers than World War I or even World War II, more American soldiers, or American people. The First World War, World War I, according to Mueller, was significant, was important because it put an end to the then prevailing perception of war as a normal instrument, as the mere continuation of policy, of politics by other means. Before World War I quote, war was perceived to be a noble, glorious, heroic, exciting, beautiful, thrilling, and above all, a manly activity. This is what feminists would say, a manly activity. And this is the reason why, when it broke out, everybody, politicians, but also to some extent the public opinion, believed that it would be a short war, a cheap war, not destructive, not costly. Since in the 19th century, the wars had indeed been pretty short and not that destructive. It was exactly the opposite that occurred. And this gave, this, of course, proved that the then pacifists were right when they were opposed to the war. The First World War was exactly what the peace pacifists, the peace activists, not the peace pacifists, sorry, this tautological, the peace activists said, had foreseen, and that criticized World War I was a calamity, a catastrophic calamity, a mass murder of millions of people. And for the first time in history, according to Mueller, therefore, war ceased to be considered as a normal activity, a necessary means, a rational means to look to obtain a desirable end. And conversely, of course, peace no longer was perceived to be decadent, corrupt, materialistic base. So the hollandization process spread after World War I, and of course, Mueller knows that World War II nevertheless broke out. So how does he explain World War II? He explains it as Hitler's personal project. So that's convincing, but this is his argument. It was Hitler's personal project. And after 1945, the Germans too, and of course, the Japanese too, became Hollandized. So this Hollandization process, ladies and gentlemen, started during the First World War, but to some extent, nobody became aware of this. And this is the reason why people like Gaddis, to whom he refers, at least indirectly, go on believing that it is the nuclear deterrence that permitted peace or stability to prevail after World War II. This argument is rejected by Mueller. Mueller considers that the Soviets and the Americans first had already been Hollandized after World War I. The Soviets because Russia, before the Bolshevik Revolution, was invaded by the Germans and a lot of people were killed. So they already rejected war. but they were forced to fight World War II because of being invaded once again by Hitler. Anti-Americans too were Hollandized, according to Mueller after World War I, since they intervened in 1917. And regarding the idea that it was the nuclear containment strategy which permitted peace to prevail among the Soviets, between the Soviet anti-Americans, this argument is rejected by Gaddis because he claims that the USSR actually, beyond or besides the fact that it was already Hollandized, was aware of America's economic primacy. He claims, this is how he expresses this by metaphor, the Soviet Union was more impressed by Detroit, the car industry, that is to say, the economic richness, prosperity of America, than by the nuclear deterrence. And he uses another metaphor to show that actually, according to him, the nuclear horror only adds a new element of horror to the already existing horror of past wars perceived by the so-called Hollandized people. The nuclear weapon, I quote, adds a new element of horror to contemplate, like, listen to this, the increased horror inspired by a perspective jump from a 50th floor compared to the horror of a jump from a 5th floor. Listen to this. Anyone who finds life even minimally satisfying is extremely unlikely to jump either from the 50th or from the 5th floor. So the nuclear revolution added a new horror to an already existing horror. It is a difference in degree, but not a difference in nature. War was already rejected. The appeal of war already no longer worked among Hollandized people before the nuclear weapon was invented. So the romantic appeal first, and the second argument of this Hollandization process is that war lost its economic rationality, is considered to be economically counterproductive. According to Mueller, wars of the past were fought to gain territory, to establish dominance, to expand the trade, to constrain an adversary, to prevent secession, to advance prosperity, to stave off attack, to replace a regime, to spread one's religion or ideology. Nowadays, according to Mueller, developed, we could call them postmodern societies, Western societies to some extent, have one overriding goal: economic well-being. Given this overriding economic goal, their wealth, their prosperity, they look at the costs of war, and they know that whatever the aim pursued, to constrain an opponent, to expand trade, to establish dominance, to gain territory, to promote ideology, etc., war will be too costly for their own well-being. Therefore, they will no longer be eager to go to war. So the Hollandization process, ladies and gentlemen, first is due to the loss of romantic appeal of the war because of the people killed, and because, second, of the rational, the economic counterproductivity of wars. Cumulated, these two dimensions explain that nowadays war has become unthinkable. It has become not merely rationally, but sub-rationally unthinkable. It does no longer come up as a possible instrument of foreign policy in postmodern developed societies. And he once again goes back to his metaphor of the jump out of the window. Listen to this. Consider a man, but we could also say a woman, of course. Consider a person on the 5th floor, thinking about the two methods permitting him or her to reach the ground floor. There are two paths. The slow one, take the stairs. The fast one jump out of the window. Every method, every path has an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage of taking the stairs is that you arrive safely on the ground floor, but it will take you some time. The advantage of jumping out of the window is that you'll be very quickly on the ground floor, but there is a disadvantage: you may break your legs or even worse. So while there are uncertainties regarding the advantages and the costs of the two alternative methods, while there are uncertainties, the decision is not that terribly difficult to take. Absolutely. The decision is not so difficult to take. That said, nobody will spend any time at all thinking about whether walking down the stairs is preferable to jumping out or vice versa. Of course, the alternative of jumping out of the window is not rejected after a rational cost advantage calculation. The alternative, jumping out of the window, never comes up as a possibility. And according to Mueller, war nowadays no longer comes up as a possibility in interactions among Hollandized, developed postmodern societies. There is no war, no risk of war between Canada and the US, not because the US, after a rational cost advantage calculation, comes to the conclusion we have no interest in attacking Canada. This possibility does not even come up. And the same is true for the Franco-German relationships, the British-Irish, the Spanish-Portuguese, etc., etc. In other words, to put it differently and to sum up John Mueller's very optimistic thesis, war no longer exists because, I quote, there is nowadays in the developed postmodern world a general unwillingness for war. Just as, to some extent, dueling is still possible, and even slavery, and even lynching, the Spanish Inquisition. It's not impossible that such institutions may re-emerge. Nevertheless, it is unlikely. The same is true for war. War nowadays no longer comes up because it has become ridiculous, absurd. It is internalized to be no longer a rational means. War therefore disappears without excommunicating it. Peace is a windfall profit. Peace is a windfall profit. There is no need to consciously build peace. There is no need to establish a world government. There is no need to change human nature. There is no need to establish goodwill or harmony among people, populations, peoples, nations. Just there is one need, there is only one condition that must be fulfilled: the perception of war as repulsive, as absurd, as ridiculous. And this is the reason why there will be no more wars gradually in the postmodern developed world. So compared to Gaddis's long peace theory, John Mueller's hypothesis of the gradual obsolescence of major war is much more optimistic because it no longer rests on a specific technological context. It is the crowning stage of a long-term irreversible evolution, since more and more societies will go through this hollandization process by becoming more and more developed. John Mueller, unfortunately, was refuted, ladies and gentlemen, only 1 or 2 years after the publication of his book, by the outbreak of the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the first Gulf War from a Western or American perspective. America decided to resort to Desert Storm in order to push Saddam Hussein back. America decided, and France too, and Great Britain too, to intervene in Yugoslavia, to intervene in Afghanistan, against Iraq once again in 2003, in Libya, etc., etc. These wars were fought, ladies and gentlemen, by developed societies, by postmodern societies, by our Western societies. According to Mueller, these societies look for economic well-being. They no longer consider wars to be rational, and yet they resort to wars. So what went wrong? Which arguments did Mueller refer to that actually were too optimistic? Let's look at Operation Enduring Freedom against the Taliban and Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein. These wars, of course, were fought as a direct or indirect consequence of the terrorist attacks. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 were staged, ladies and gentlemen, by people who were eager to commit suicide. Those who launched the aeroplanes on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center on the Pentagon accepted to die. They committed suicide. In other words, they did not find life minimally satisfying. Otherwise, they would have stopped short from committing suicide. What does that mean? This means that, and this is a realist argument, if on the world political scene only one actor does not find life minimally satisfying to consider that he prefers to live rather than to die, if there is only one actor thinking this, all the other ones may one day be forced to defend themselves against a possible attack. And then war becomes again rational. So Mueller's optimism is not logically refuted, but it will only be true once the whole world will become Hollandized, and this is not that guaranteed. And Mueller agrees upon this when he writes, in developed societies, prosperity has become the overriding goal after such basic concerns as life and security are taken care of. After security is guaranteed, economic well-being will become the overriding goal. So first and foremost, units, populations, individuals or states, in our case, have to guarantee their security. This is a realist argument. Security first, then other aims such as economic well-being. What's more, the Western states, the Western societies waged wars in Yugoslavia, in Libya, in Syria and Iraq nowadays. Things are a bit different. We'll come back to this in our second semester class on democracies at war. At least in Yugoslavia, in Iraq 2003, in Libya 2011, the wars that were fought despite our security not threatened. What does that mean? This means that our developed societies found new values that were worth to be defended or promoted by violent means. In this book, Mueller claims that in the past, wars were fought to gain territory, to establish dominance, to expand trade, to constrain an opponent, to advance prosperity, to stay above attack, to replace regimes, to promote an ideology or religion. If we try to apply these motivations to our wars in Yugoslavia, against Iraq in 2003, in Libya, what were the aims pursued? Protect human rights. We can say that this comes close to promoting an ideology. We can say that promote human rights is a new value. Whatever the response, those who are eager to go to war, our statesmen, always find a justification. The new justification is war on behalf of humanity, humanitarian wars, as summed up by the French Jean-Jacques Villemer. La guerre au nom de l'humanité, on behalf of humanity. To permit life to prevail, we have to kill those who threaten life of human populations, of minorities, etc., etc. So somehow, war always finds a way, to quote Bertolt Brecht. At least those who are eager to wage wars will find justifications. And to say the least, Western populations, whatever their overriding goals, be it economic prosperity or not, did not prevent their statesmen from launching and waging these wars. So our Hollandized societies are not that Hollandized, or our rejection of wars are not that universal, or at least we do not feel concerned by some of the wars that our military or that our corporate warriors are fighting. So I'm afraid we cannot be that optimistic as Mueller was some 30 years ago in the then context. All theories, ladies and gentlemen, is a general claim, a general statement, that all theories are embedded in a specific time and somehow a specific space context. And what was true, the optimism prevailing 30 years ago, because of the peaceful end of the Cold War, of course, this optimism maybe did not survive the end of the Cold War. Anyway, John Mueller also focuses on the economic irrationality of wars. We will see in our next chapter, chapter 7, those theories claiming that economic interdependence is a peace point factor, and we will see, of course, the contradictory argument saying that interdependence does not necessarily permit peace to prevail. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to today's class. I wish you a great day, and I hope you come back next week. Goodbye.